Chapter 12. The night was at its deepest when Alvin woke. Something had disturbed him, some whisper of sound that had crept into his mind despite the endless thunder of the falls. He sat up in the darkness, straining his eyes across the hidden land, while, with indrawn breath, he listened to the drumming roar of the water and the softer, more fugitive sounds of the creatures of the night. Nothing was visible. The starlight was too dim to reveal the miles of country that lay hundreds of feet below. Only a jagged line of darker night eclipsing the stars told of the mountains on the southern horizon. In the darkness beside him, Alvin heard his companion roll over and sit up. "What is it?" came a whispered voice. "I thought I heard a noise." "What sort of noise?" "I don't know. Perhaps it was just my imagination." There was a silence while two pairs of eyes peered out into the mystery of the night. Then, suddenly, Hilvar caught Alvin's arm. "Look," he whispered. Far to the south glowed a solitary point of light, too low in the heavens to be a star. It was a brilliant white, tinged with violet, and even as they watched, it began to climb the spectrum of intensity, until the eye could no longer bear to look upon it. Then it exploded, and it seemed as if lightning had struck below the rim of the world. For a brief instant, the mountains and the land they encircled were etched with fire against the darkness of the night. Ages later came the ghost of a far-off explosion, and in the woods below, a sudden wind stirred among the trees. It died away swiftly, and one by one, the routed stars crept back into the sky. For the second time in his life, Alvin knew fear. It was not as personal and imminent as it had been in the Chamber of the Moving Ways, when he had made the decision that took him to Lys. Perhaps it was awe rather than fear. He was looking into the face of the unknown, and it was as if he had already sensed that out there, beyond the mountains, was something he must go to meet. "What was that?" he whispered at length. There was a pause so long that he repeated the question. "I'm trying to find out," said Hilvar, and was silent again. Alvin guessed what he was doing and did not interrupt his friend's silent quest. Presently, Hilvar gave a little sigh of disappointment. "Everyone is asleep," he said. "There was no one who could tell me. We must wait until morning, unless I wake one of my friends, and I would not like to do that unless it is really important." Alvin wondered what Hilvar would consider a matter of real importance. He was just going to suggest, a little sarcastically, that this might well merit interrupting someone's sleep. Before he could make the proposal, Hilvar spoke again. "I've just remembered," he said, rather apologetically. "It's a long time since I came here, and I'm not quite certain about my bearings. But that must be Shalmarain." "Shalmarain? Does it still exist?" "Yes, I'd almost forgotten. Soranus once told me that the fortress lies in those mountains. Of course, it's been in ruins for ages, but perhaps someone still lives there." Shalmarain. To these children of two races, so widely differing in culture and history, this was indeed a name of magic. In all the long history of Earth, there had been no greater epic than the defense of Shalmarain against an invader who had conquered all the universe. Though the true facts were utterly lost in the mists which had gathered so thickly around the Dawn Ages, the legends had never been forgotten and would last as long as man endured. Presently, Hilvar's voice came again out of the darkness. "The people of the south could tell us more. I have some friends there. I will call them in the morning." Alvin scarcely heard him. He was deep in his own thoughts, trying to remember all that he had ever heard of Shalmarain. It was little enough. After this immense lapse of time, no one could tell the truth from the legend. All that was certain was that the Battle of Shalmarain marked the end of man's conquests and the beginning of his long decline. Among those mountains, thought Alvin, might lie the answers to all the problems that had tormented him for so many years. "How long," he said to Hilvar, "would it take us to reach the fortress?" "I've never been there, but it's much farther than I intended to go. I doubt if we could do it in a day." "Can't we use the ground car?" "No. The way lies through the mountains, and no cars can go there." Alvin thought it over. He was tired, his feet were sore, and the muscles of his thighs were still aching from the unaccustomed effort. It was very tempting to leave it for another time. Yet, there might be no other time. Beneath the dim light of the failing stars, not a few of which had died since Shalmorain was built, Alvin wrestled with his thoughts, and presently made his decision. Nothing had changed. The mountains resumed their watch over the sleeping land. But a turning point in history had come and gone, and the human race was moving toward a strange, new future. Alvin and Hilvar slept no more that night, but broke camp with the first glow of dawn. The hill was drenched with dew, and Alvin marveled at the sparkling jewelry which weighed down each blade and leaf. The swish of the wet grass fascinated him as he plowed through it, and looking back up the hill, he could see his path stretching behind him like a dark band across the shining ground. The sun had just lifted above the eastern wall of Lys when they reached the outskirts of the forest. Here, nature had returned to her own. Even Hilvar seemed somewhat lost among the gigantic trees that blocked the sunlight and cast pools of shadow on the jungle floor. Fortunately, the river from the fall flowed south in a line too straight to be altogether natural, and by keeping to its edge, they could avoid the denser undergrowth. A good deal of Hilvar's time was spent in controlling Kreef, who disappeared occasionally into the jungle or went skimming wildly across the water. Even Alvin, to whom everything was still so new, could feel that the forest had a fascination not possessed by the smaller, more cultivated woods of northern Lys. Few trees were alike. Most of them were in various stages of devolution, and some had reverted through the ages almost to their original natural forms. Many were obviously not of Earth at all, probably not even of the solar system. Watching like sentinels over the lesser trees were giant sequoias, 300 or 400 feet high. Once, they had been called the oldest things on Earth. They were still a little older than man. The river was widening now. Ever and again, it opened into small lakes, upon which tiny islands lay at anchor. There were insects here, brilliantly colored creatures swinging to and fro over the surface of the water. Once, despite Hilvar's commands, Kreef darted away to join his distant cousins. He disappeared instantly in a cloud of glittering wings, and the sound of angry buzzing floated toward them. A moment later, the cloud erupted, and Kreef came back across the water, almost too quickly for the eye to follow. Thereafter, he kept very close to Hilvar, and did not stray again. Toward evening, they caught occasional glimpses of the mountains ahead. The river that had been so faithful a guide was flowing sluggishly now, as if it too were nearing the end of its journey. But it was clear that they could not reach the mountains by nightfall. Well before sunset, the forest had become so dark that further progress was impossible. The great trees lay in pools of shadow, and a cold wind was sweeping through the leaves. Alvin and Hilvar settled down for the night beside a giant redwood whose topmost branches were still ablaze with sunlight. When at last the hidden sun went down, the lights still lingered on the dancing waters. The two explorers, for such they now considered themselves, and such indeed they were, lay in the gathering gloom, watching the river and thinking of all that they had seen. Presently, Alvin felt once again steal over himself that sense of delicious drowsiness he had known for the first time on the previous night, and he gladly resigned himself to sleep. It might not be needed in the effortless life of Diaspar, but he welcomed it here. In the final moments, before unconsciousness overcame him, he found himself wondering who last had come this way, and how long since. The sun was high when they left the forest and stood at last before the mountain walls of Lys. Ahead of them, the ground rose steeply to the sky in waves of barren rock. Here, the river came to an end as spectacular as its beginning, for the ground opened in its path, and it sank roaring from sight. Alvin wondered what had happened to it, and through what subterranean caves it traveled, before it emerged again into the light of day. Perhaps the lost oceans of Earth still existed, far down in the eternal darkness, and this ancient river still felt the call that drew it to the sea. For a moment, Hilvar stood looking at the whirlpool and the broken land beyond. Then he pointed to a gap in the hills. "Shalmoraine lies in that direction," he said confidently. Alvin did not ask how he knew. He assumed that Hilvar's mind had made brief contact with that of a friend many miles away, and the information he needed had been silently passed to him. It did not take long to reach the gap, and when they had passed through it, they found themselves facing a curious plateau with gently sloping sides. Alvin felt no tiredness now, and no fear, only a taut expectancy and a sense of approaching adventure. What he would discover, he had no conception. That he would discover something, he did not doubt at all. As they approached the summit, the nature of the ground altered abruptly. The lower slopes had consisted of porous volcanic stone, piled here and there in great mounds of slag. Now, the surface turned suddenly to hard, glassy sheets, smooth and treacherous, as if the rock had once run in molten rivers down the mountain. The rim of the plateau was almost at their feet. Hilvar reached it first, and a few seconds later, Alvin overtook him and stood speechless at his side. For they stood on the edge, not of the plateau they had expected, but of a giant bowl 1/2 mile deep and 3 miles in diameter. Ahead of them, the ground plunged steeply downward, slowly leveling out at the bottom of the valley and rising again, more and more steeply, to the opposite rim. The lowest part of the bowl was occupied by a circular lake, the surface of which trembled continuously, as if agitated by incessant waves. Although it lay in the full glare of the sun, the whole of that great depression was ebon black. What material formed the crater, Alvin and Hilvar could not even guess, but it was black as the rock of a world that had never known a sun. Nor was that all, for lying beneath their feet and ringing the entire crater was a seamless band of metal, some 100 feet wide, tarnished by immeasurable age, but still showing no slightest sign of corrosion. As their eyes grew accustomed to the unearthly scene, Alvin and Hilvar realized that the blackness of the bowl was not as absolute as they had thought. Here and there, so fugitive that they could only see them indirectly, tiny explosions of light were flickering in the ebon walls. They came at random, vanishing as soon as they were born, like the reflections of stars on a broken sea. "It's wonderful," gasped Alvin. "But what is it?" "It looks like a reflector of some kind. But it's so black." "Only to our eyes, remember. We do not know what radiations they used." "But surely there must be more than this. Where is the fortress?" Hilvar pointed to the lake. "Look carefully," he said. Alvin stared through the quivering roof of the lake, trying to plumb the secrets it concealed within its depths. At first, he could see nothing. Then, in the shallows near its edge, he made out a faint reticulation of light and shade. He was able to trace the pattern out toward the center of the lake, until the deepening water hid all further details. The dark lake had engulfed the fortress. Down there lay the ruins of once mighty buildings, overthrown by time. Yet, not all of them had been submerged, for on the far side of the crater, Alvin now noticed piles of jumbled stones and great blocks that must once have formed part of massive walls. The waters lapped around them, but had not yet risen far enough to complete their victory. "We'll go around the lake," said Hilvar, speaking softly, as if the majestic desolation had struck awe into his soul. "Perhaps we may find something in those ruins over there." First, the few hundred yards, the crater walls were so steep and smooth that it was difficult to stand upright, but after a while they reached the gentler slopes and could walk without difficulty. Near the border of the lake, the smooth ebony of the surface was concealed by a thin layer of soil, which the winds of Lys must have brought here through the ages. A quarter of a mile away, titanic blocks of stone were piled one upon the other, like the discarded toys of an infant giant. Here, a section of a massive wall was still recognizable. There, two carven obelisks marked what had once been a mighty entrance. Everywhere grew mosses and creeping plants and tiny stunted trees. Even the wind was hushed. So Alvin and Hilvar came to the ruins of Shalmoraine. Against those walls, and against the energies that had housed forces that could shatter a world to dust, had flamed and thundered and been utterly defeated. Once, those peaceful skies had blazed with fires, torn from the hearts of suns, and the mountains of Lys must have quailed like living things beneath the fury of their masters. No one had ever captured Shalmoraine, but now, the fortress, the impregnable fortress, had fallen at last, captured and destroyed by the patient tendrils of the ivy, the generations of blindly burrowing worms, and the slowly rising waters of the lake. Overawed by its majesty, Alvin and Hilvar walked in silence towards the colossal wreck. They passed into the shadow of a broken wall and entered a canyon where the mountains of stone had split asunder. Before them lay the lake, and presently they stood with the dark water lapping at their feet. Tiny waves, no more than a few inches high, broke endlessly upon the narrow shore. Hilvar was the first to speak, and his voice held a hint of uncertainty, which made Alvin glance at him in sudden surprise. "There's something here I don't understand," he said slowly. "There's no wind, so what causes these ripples? The water should be perfectly still." Before Alvin could think of any reply, Hilvar dropped to the ground, turned his head on one side, and immersed his right ear in the water. Alvin wondered what he hoped to discover in such a ludicrous position. Then he realized he was listening. With some repugnance, for the rayless waters looked singularly uninviting, he followed Hilvar's example. The first shock of coldness lasted only for a second. When it passed, he could hear, faint but distinct, a steady rhythmic throbbing. It was as if he could hear, from far down in the depths of the lake, the beating of a giant heart. They shook the water from their hair and stared at each other with silent surmise. Neither liked to say what he thought, that the lake was alive. "It would be best," said Hilvar presently, "if we searched among these ruins and kept away from the lake." "Do you think that there's something down there?" asked Alvin, pointing to the enigmatic ripples that were still breaking against his feet. "Could it be dangerous?" "Nothing that possesses a mind is dangerous," Hilvar responded. Is that true? Thought Alvin. What of the invaders? "I can detect no thoughts of any kind here, but I do not believe we are alone. It is very strange." They walked slowly back toward the ruins of the fortress, each carrying in his mind the sound of that steady, muffled pulsing. It seemed to Alvin that mystery was piling upon mystery, and that for all his efforts, he was getting further and further from any understanding of the truths he sought. It did not seem that the ruins could teach them anything, but they searched carefully among the piles of rubble and the great mounds of stone. Here, perhaps, lay the graves of buried machines, the machines that had done their work so long ago. They would be useless now, thought Alvin, if the invaders returned. Why had they never come back? But that was yet another mystery. He had enough enigmas to deal with. There was no need to seek for any more. A few yards from the lake, they found a small clearing among the rubble. It had been covered with weeds, but they were now blackened and charred by tremendous heat, so that they crumbled to ashes as Alvin and Hilvar approached, smearing their legs with streaks of charcoal. At the center of the clearing stood a metal tripod, firmly anchored to the ground and supporting a circular ring which was tilted on its axis, so that it pointed to a spot halfway up the sky. At first sight, it seemed that the ring enclosed nothing. Then, as Alvin looked more carefully, he saw that it was filled with a faint haze that tormented the eye by looking at the edge of the visible spectrum. It was the glow of power, and from this mechanism, he did not doubt, had come the explosion of light that had lured them to Shalmarine. They did not venture any closer, but stood looking at the machine from a safe distance. They were on the right track, thought Alvin. Now it only remained to discover who, or what, had set this apparatus here, and what their purpose might be. That tilted ring, it was clearly aimed out into space. Had the flash they had observed been some kind of signal? That was a thought which had breathtaking implications. "Alvin," said Hilvar suddenly, his voice quiet but urgent. "We have visitors." Alvin spun on his heels and found himself staring at a triangle of lidless eyes. That, at least, was his first impression, that behind the staring eyes he saw the outlines of a small but complex machine. Then, behind the staring eyes, he saw the outlines of a small but complex machine. It was hanging in the air a few feet above the ground, and it was like no robot he had ever before seen. Once the initial surprise had worn off, he felt himself the complete master of the situation. All his life he had given orders to machines, and the fact that this one was unfamiliar was of no importance. For that matter, he had never seen more than a few % of the robots that had provided his daily needs in Diaspar. "Can you speak?" he asked. There was silence. "Is anyone controlling you?" Still silence. "Go away. Come here. Rise. Fall." None of the conventional control thoughts produced any effect. The machine remained contemptuously inactive. That suggested two possibilities. It was either too unintelligent to understand him, or it was very intelligent indeed, with its own powers of choice and volition. In that case, he must treat it as an equal. Even then, he might underestimate it, but it would bear him no resentment, for conceit was not a vice from which robots often suffered. Hilvar could not help laughing at Alvin's obvious discomfiture. He was just about to suggest that he should take over the task of communicating, when the words died on his lips. The stillness of Shalmarine was shattered by an ominous and utterly unmistakable sound. The gurgling splash of a very large body emerging from water. It was the second time since he had left Diaspar that Alvin wished he were at home. Then he remembered that this was not the spirit in which he went to meet adventure, and he began to walk slowly but deliberately toward the lake. The creature, now emerging from the dark water, seemed a monstrous parody, in living matter, of the robot that was still subjecting them to its silent scrutiny. That same equilateral arrangement of eyes could be no coincidence. Even the pattern of tentacles and little jointed limbs had been roughly reproduced. Beyond that, however, the resemblance ceased. The robot did not possess, it obviously did not require, the fringe of delicate feathery palps which beat the water with a steady rhythm. the stubby, multiple legs on which the beast was humping itself ashore, or the ventilating inlets, if that's what they were, which now wheezed fitfully in the thin air. Most of the creature's body remained in the water. Only the first 10 feet reared itself into what was clearly an alien element. The entire beast was about 50 feet long, and even anyone with no knowledge of biology would have realized that there was something altogether wrong about it. It had an extraordinary air of improvisation and careless design, as if its components had been manufactured without much forethought and thrown roughly together when the need arose. Despite its size and their initial doubts, neither Alvin nor Hilvar felt the slightest nervousness once they had a clear look at the dweller in the lake. There was an engaging clumsiness about the creature which made it quite impossible to regard it as a serious menace, even if there was any reason to suppose it might be dangerous. The human race had long ago overcome its childhood terror of the merely alien in appearance. That was a fear which could no longer survive after the first contact with friendly extraterrestrial races. "Let me deal with this," said Hilvar quietly. "I'm used to handling animals." "But this isn't an animal," whispered Alvin in return. "I'm sure it's intelligent and owns that robot." "The robot may own it. In any case, its mentality must be very strange. I can still detect no sign of thought." "Hello? What's happening?" The monster had not moved from its half-raised position at the water's edge, which it seemed to be maintaining with considerable effort. But a semi-transparent membrane had begun to form at the center of the triangle of eyes, a membrane that pulsed and quivered, and presently started to emit audible sounds. They were low-pitched, resonant boomings which created no intelligible words, though it was obvious that the creature was trying to speak to them. It was painful to watch this desperate attempt at communication. For several minutes, the creature struggled in vain. Then, quite suddenly, it seemed to realize that it had made a mistake. The throbbing membrane contracted in size, and the sounds it emitted rose several octaves in frequency, and they entered the spectrum of normal speech. Recognizable words began to form, though they were still interspersed with gibberish. It was as if the creature was remembering a vocabulary it had known long ago, but had had no occasion to use for many years. Hilvar tried to give what assistance he could. "We can understand you now," he said, speaking slowly and distinctly. "Can we help you? We saw the light you made. It brought us here from Lys." At the word Lys, the creature seemed to droop, as if it had suffered some bitter disappointment. "Lead," it repeated. It could not manage the S very well, so that the word sounded like lead. "Always from lead. No one else ever comes. We call the great ones, but they do not hear." "Who are the great ones?" asked Alvin, leaning forward eagerly. The delicate, ever-moving palps waved briefly toward the sky. "The great ones," it said, "from the planets of eternal day. They will come. The Master promised us." This did not seem to make matters any clearer. Before Alvin could continue his cross-examination, Hilvar intervened again. His questioning was so patient, so sympathetic, and yet so penetrating, that Alvin knew better than to interrupt, despite his eagerness. He did not like to admit that Hilvar was his superior in intelligence, but there was no doubt that his flair for handling animals extended even to this fantastic being. What was more, it seemed to respond to him. Its speech became more distinct as the conversation proceeded, and where at first it had been brusque to the point of rudeness, it presently elaborated its answers and volunteered information on its own. Alvin lost all consciousness of the passage of time as Hilvar pieced together the incredible story. They could not discover the whole truth, There was endless room for conjectures and debate. As the creature answered Hilvar's questions ever more and more willingly, its appearance began to change. It slumped back into the lake, and the stubby legs that had been supporting it seemed to dissolve into the rest of its body. Presently, a still more extraordinary change occurred. The three huge eyes slowly closed, shrank to pinpoints, and vanished completely. It was as if the creature had seen all that it wished to for the moment, and therefore had no further use for eyes. Other and more subtle alterations were continually taking place, and eventually, almost all that remained above the surface of the water was the vibrating diaphragm through which the creature spoke. Doubtless, this too would be dissolved back into the original amorphous mass of protoplasm when it was no longer required. Alvin found it hard to believe that intelligence could reside in so unstable a form, and his biggest surprise was yet to come. Though it seemed obvious that the creature was not of terrestrial origin, it was some time before even Hilvar, despite his greater knowledge of biology, realized the type of organism they were dealing with. It was not a single entity. In all their conversations with it, it always referred to itself as we. In fact, it was nothing less than a colony of independent creatures, organized and controlled by unknown forces. Animals of a remotely similar type, the Medusae, for example, had once flourished in the ancient oceans of Earth. Some of them had been of great size, trailing their translucent bodies in forests of stinging tentacles over 50 or 100 feet of water. But none of them had attained even the faintest flicker of intelligence, beyond the power to react to simple stimuli. There was certainly intelligence here, though it was failing, degenerating intelligence. Never was Alvin to forget this unearthly meeting, as Hilvar slowly pieced together the story of the Master, while the protean polyp groped for unfamiliar words. The dark lake lapped at the ruins of Shalmoraine, and the trioptic robot watched them with unwavering eyes.